The golden feast at Hofburg froze in an instant. Amid the music and flickering candlelight, Archduchess Maria Magdalena clutched her head, her wine spilling across the table. They said it was a stroke. But was it the toll of a life drained by ceremony, or a carefully veiled act of poison? In this video, we uncover the forgotten tragedy of Archduchess Maria Magdalena, a Habsburg princess who collapsed in the very heart of power and splendor. She was born into the very center of European power. Vienna, March 26, 1689. Her first breath taken within walls heavy with history, incense, and expectation. Archduchess Maria Magdalena Josefa of Austria was the daughter of Holy Roman Emperor Leopold III and his third wife, Eleanor Magdalene of Neuburg, a devout and politically astute empress consort. From the moment she opened her eyes, she was not merely a child, but a living thread in the vast tapestry of the Habsburg dynasty. Her world was one of vaulted ceilings, marble floors, and red velvet drapes that muted the winter winds sweeping across the Danube. To the public, she was a symbol of continuity, a guarantee that the Habsburg line, already centuries old, would continue to rule unbroken. But behind those gilded gates, her days were governed by an entirely different reality: the unyielding discipline of court life. From infancy, every gesture was rehearsed, every word weighed. Nurses and governesses attended to her not only to feed or comfort her, but to ensure she embodied the grace expected of a daughter of the emperor. Even her laughter was moderated, her posture corrected, her gaze directed. To walk too quickly down a corridor was unseemly. To linger too long with a servant might invite quiet reprimand. Her closest bonds were with her mother and sisters. The Empress Eleanor was a formidable presence, pious, politically aware, and committed to the moral and ceremonial order of the court. Maria Magdalena, along with her sisters Maria Josefa and Maria Elizabeth, shared a tightly knit world of embroidery lessons, Latin prayers, and the constant murmur of diplomacy in the background. The sisters exchanged confidences in whispered corners, their conversations a rare refuge from the formality that ruled every waking moment. The Habsburg court of the early 18th century was a place where women of noble birth were not merely daughters, sisters, or wives. They were political currency. Marriages were treaties. Engagements were alliances. A princess was a pawn in a game that stretched across the map of Europe, and from the moment she could understand words, Maria Magdalena would have known that her life's trajectory was not hers to chart. And yet, there must have been moments, small, fleeting, when she felt the magic of her surroundings. The endless candlelit corridors during winter festivities, the solemn beauty of the Hofburg chapel, where organ music rolled through the stone like distant thunder. The carriages that carried her family through Vienna's narrow streets, the public craning to glimpse the imperial children through frosted windows. To the city beyond the palace gates, she was a fairy tale figure. To herself, she was a girl raised in a glass case, safe but watched. Education was rigorous but deeply traditional. History lessons framed the Habsburgs as chosen by God to defend Catholic Europe. Geography was taught not as an academic subject, but as a map of allies and enemies. She learned French and Italian alongside Latin and the formal German of court. Music was compulsory. Dance was essential. Every skill had a purpose, not to broaden her mind, but to refine her as a representative of the dynasty. Yet within these lessons lay the first quiet signs of her nature. She was dutiful, but not ambitious. Gentle with her younger siblings, she seemed to prefer harmony over competition. She excelled at music, particularly the harpsichord, and was said to have a voice well suited for the sacred hymns sung at court masses. In portraits from her youth, her expression is composed but reserved, the dark eyes revealing little, as if already schooled in the art of withholding emotion in public. What she could not withhold was the effect of her environment. The palace was both cradle and cage. Every friend she might have was also a subject of the emperor. Every gesture of affection was shadowed by formality. Even the simplest moments, a shared sweet with a sister, a smile from her mother, took place under the gaze of attendants, who would later relay every detail to the Empress's household staff. This was the world in which Maria Magdalena learned to measure her words, to mask her feelings, to move like a figure in a carefully choreographed dance. And while it gave her poise, it also wove the first threads of isolation into her life. For in the Habsburg court, privacy was rare, and personal choice rarer still. Outside, Europe was changing. The War of the Spanish Succession loomed on the horizon. Diplomats and envoys filled the palace corridors, their voices a constant hum of intrigue and negotiation. Inside, the children of the emperor were reminded daily of their role: to serve the empire through obedience, appearance, and strategic unions. For a little girl, this might have felt like security. Predictable days, fine clothes, servants to attend every need. But as Maria Magdalena grew, the walls that kept her safe began to reveal their true nature. They were not merely barriers to danger. They were boundaries to her life. And so, even in the glow of chandeliers and the rustle of silk gowns, a quiet truth settled over her, that her future was not hers to imagine, but hers to endure. The golden gate of her childhood opened not into a garden, but into a labyrinth, a palace that promised everything a princess could desire, and yet, at its heart, kept her from ever stepping beyond its shadow. By the time Maria Magdalena reached her 20s, the question whispered in corridors and salons was always the same: when will she be wed? For a Habsburg princess, marriage was not a matter of romance or personal preference. It was destiny. The path for imperial daughters was written before they learned to write their names. At a certain age, suitors would be considered, alliances weighed, and a match arranged that would best serve the interests of the dynasty. But no such match ever came for Maria Magdalena. One by one, she watched her sisters depart. Maria Josefa was sent to Saxony, married to Frederick Augustus II, Elector of Saxony and future King of Poland, in a union that fortified ties between Vienna and Dresden. Another sister, Maria Elizabeth, was offered in marriage to foreign courts, though illness and politics altered her fate more than once. Each departure was marked with grand farewells, weeks of festivities, and processions through the streets of Vienna. For the sisters leaving, it was the beginning of a new life, however uncertain. For Maria Magdalena, it was another door closing. Why she remained was a question without an official answer. Some believed her health was fragile, that years of the stiff, ceremonial life at court had left her physically unfit for the rigors of childbearing, a requirement for any dynastic bride. Others speculated that political circumstances simply left no suitable match, alliances shifting too quickly, or rivalries making certain unions impossible. There were even those who whispered that she had been deliberately kept in Vienna as a trusted figure to manage the Empress's household and serve as a constant presence for her aging mother. Whatever the reason, the reality was the same. She was left behind. The court, in its opulent but unforgiving way, had a role for such women, those too valuable to dismiss, too visible to ignore, but too inconvenient to marry off. Maria Magdalena became a fixture in the imperial palace, her life defined not by a husband or children, but by the service she rendered to the family that had decided her fate. She was named Hofdame, a lady-in-waiting of the highest rank, serving her mother and later her nieces and younger female relatives. It was an honored position, but it came with invisible chains. As Hofdame, she oversaw the logistics of courtly events, balls, receptions, religious ceremonies, ensuring that every detail was flawless, every moment choreographed to reflect the grandeur of the Habsburg name. The work was endless, and in its own way, isolating. While she was ever present at court functions, she was never the center of them. She stood at the edge of ballrooms, observing conversations she would never join, watching dances she would never lead. She learned to smile on command, to nod politely at ambassadors and visiting princes, to glide silently through the glittering world that had become her workplace. If there was bitterness, it never escaped her lips. But those who knew her well, servants who had been in her chambers since childhood, musicians who had played at her side, would later recall a certain stillness in her demeanor. It was not coldness, but the composure of someone who had learned to expect little from the world beyond duty. Vienna at the turn of the 18th century was alive with music, diplomacy, and the subtle theater of power. For Maria Magdalena, the city beyond the Hofburg was a sound she heard through closed windows, a pulse she felt but could not follow. She could walk in its gardens, visit its chapels, but always as a princess, never as a woman alone. Every step outside was trailed by attendants, every glance noted, every absence recorded. In the gilded salons of the palace, she was surrounded by wealth, yet untouched by intimacy. The courtiers who flattered her did so because of her title, not because they knew her mind. The ministers who bowed before her were bowing to the emperor's daughter, not to Maria Magdalena the person. Even the portraits painted of her in these years seemed to reflect this distance. Her expression composed, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the viewer, as if already resigned to the role she had been assigned. Still, she fulfilled that role with precision. The banquets she coordinated dazzled foreign dignitaries. The ceremonies she oversaw ran without flaw. Her work sustained the rhythm of court life, even if it slowly drained her own. In the rigid hierarchy of the imperial household, she was indispensable, yet also invisible. And perhaps that was the cruelest paradox of her existence: to be constantly seen, yet never truly noticed. Her sister's letters from abroad brought glimpses of lives shaped by politics, but also touched by the unpredictability of marriage. Joys, children, personal sorrows. Maria Magdalena had none of these. Instead, she occupied a space between the inner sanctum of family and the formal theater of statecraft. She was trusted with secrets, but denied the chance to create her own. In the great genealogies of the Habsburgs, she would be remembered as a daughter of the emperor, a princess who never married, a court lady of impeccable service. But within those few lines lies the long, quiet truth: that hers was the life of a bird in a silver cage, fed, sheltered, and adorned with the finest feathers, yet unable to fly anywhere beyond the reach of the palace walls. And as the years passed, the sound of those closing doors, each sister leaving, each potential match disappearing, must have grown louder in her mind, even if she never spoke of it. The silver cage was beautiful, but it was still a cage. If Maria Magdalena's unmarried state had sealed her fate within the palace, her appointment as Hofdame cemented it. It was not merely a job. It was a lifetime performance under the brightest and most unforgiving lights in Europe. Every hour of her day was bound to the pulse of court life, dictated by the schedule of audiences, masses, banquets, and processions. Her role was deceptively grand. As Hofdame to the Empress, and later to younger female relatives, she was the invisible architect of the court's public face. When foreign ambassadors arrived, it was she who ensured the reception rooms shimmered with candlelight, that the silverware gleamed, and that every lady in attendance knew precisely when to curtsy. When a wedding was to be celebrated, she orchestrated the seating of princes and archduchesses according to rank, so that no one's pride or diplomatic balance was disturbed. This was the work the world never saw. On the night of a grand ball, all eyes might be on the dancers, the music, the emperor himself. But behind that spectacle was Maria Magdalena, ensuring the flowers matched the colors of the bride's dowry, that the musicians understood the tempo of the entrance march, that the sequence of toasts flowed without pause or awkward silence. And yet, for all its pageantry, the work was relentless. There was no allowance for fatigue, no margin for error. A single misplaced goblet, a late cue for the orchestra, an ill-timed entrance could be read as a slight to a visiting monarch or a breach of centuries-old etiquette. Every event was a performance for which the stakes were political as much as social. Over time, the weight of such precision left its mark. Even in portraits from this period, Maria Magdalena appears composed to the point of stillness. Her back straight, her hands folded, her eyes focused somewhere beyond the viewer, as if already envisioning the next event to oversee. Those who encountered her privately noted that her speech was measured, her expressions restrained, her gestures controlled. It was the demeanor of someone who had learned that in a world where missteps could echo for years, the safest way forward was to take none at all. Physically, the strain was real. Court dress in the early 18th century was not made for comfort. Layers of brocade and silk, stiff corsetry, heavy jewels, each an emblem of rank but also a burden on the body. Days were spent standing through audiences, evenings pacing vast halls during receptions, hours bent over tables arranging place cards and supervising servants. The air in the grand halls was thick with the mingled scents of beeswax candles, perfume, roasted meats, and, inevitably, the human press of hundreds of bodies in winter-warmed rooms. It was an environment that left her lightheaded on more than one occasion. Yet fainting at court was not the indulgent drama seen in plays. It was a mark of weakness. Recovering quickly, smiling through the haze, and resuming one's duties was the only acceptable response. It was in this atmosphere that Maria Magdalena's life began to resemble a strange kind of living metaphor. A delicate bloom trapped beneath a glass dome. Protected from storms, yes, but also deprived of the open air, her beauty maintained at the cost of her freedom. The court admired the dome, the careful preservation, but never considered what it meant for the living thing inside. To outsiders, she seemed to live a charmed existence, adorned in silks, present at every ball, standing beside the empress during major ceremonies. But within the palace walls, she was a working figure, a cog in the machine of imperial image-making. Her name was rarely in the formal bulletins, except as part of ceremonial lists. She was known not for scandal, not for romance, not for personal achievement, but for flawless service to the rituals that sustained the monarchy's grandeur. And that, perhaps, was the quiet tragedy of this stage of her life. The very perfection of her public role erased her private self. There was no applause for her precision, no reward for years of unerring etiquette, only the expectation that tomorrow she would rise and do it all again. In time, even joy became ceremonial. Feasts, dances, and celebrations were not moments of release, but stages upon which she was always on. The music played, the candles flickered, the crowd laughed. But for her, it was part of the endless choreography. The palace's rhythm was her own heartbeat, steady and unchanging. leaving little room for spontaneity. And so, surrounded by beauty, she carried the quiet weight of its upkeep. Every bow, every polished floor, every perfectly timed toast was another thread in the invisible net that held her life in place, secure, admired, and utterly confined. Vienna in the early decades of the 18th century lived for its evenings. By day, the city was a seat of imperial business, filled with ministers, clerks, and couriers moving between offices and palaces. But as night fell, the lamps were lit, and the capital of the Habsburg Empire transformed into a world of candlelit salons, operatic performances, and banquets that could stretch until dawn. For the unmarried daughters of the imperial family, these gatherings were more than entertainment. They were obligations. Appearances were not optional. Each outing was a performance of refinement and vitality, a statement to foreign dignitaries and court society that the dynasty remained a beacon of culture and stability. Archduchess Maria Magdalena, though no longer a candidate for marriage, was expected to embody that same elegance as her younger relatives. Her presence at a ball or banquet was as much a political gesture as a personal activity. The grand feasts at the Hofburg Palace were the pinnacle of this social theater. The great hall would be dressed in gold and crimson, with crystal chandeliers dripping light onto polished marble floors. Long tables gleamed with silver platters piled high with roasted game, sugared fruits, and elaborate pastries shaped like crowns and coats of arms. Musicians in powdered wigs filled the air with concertos by composers favored at court, the notes swelling beneath the chatter of nobles, trading both compliments and calculated remarks. Maria Magdalena's place in these rooms was carefully set, sometimes beside her mother, sometimes flanking a visiting royal. Her gown would be layered with brocade and heavy silk, stitched with metallic thread that caught the candlelight. Jewels at her throat and wrists glimmered, their beauty masking their weight. Every step she took in such attire required balance and endurance. The skirts alone could weigh more than 20 pounds, their tight bodice constricting each breath. The demands were physical as much as social. Hours spent in such finery, under constant observation, meant sore feet and a stiff back by the time the evening was over. The air in the banquet hall was warm and heavy, with the mingling scents of wax, perfume, and spiced wine. Conversation required focus, each remark judged for propriety, each smile calibrated to the moment. It was here, among the polished rituals of the court, that Maria Magdalena began to feel the first shadows creep into her body. At first, it was a faint headache during the later hours of a feast, dismissed as fatigue. Then came brief spells of dizziness, which she covered with a quick sip of water and a polite excuse to adjust her seat. On occasion, she felt her knees soften beneath her. But in the world of the Habsburg court, such incidents were explained away as the natural toll of long evenings and elaborate gowns. No one asked if the constant strain might be harming her. To be unwell was to be absent, and to be absent was to be forgotten. And so, she returned, night after night, to the glowing halls, masking discomfort behind a practiced serenity. The rhythm of these events was relentless. A banquet for a royal anniversary was followed days later by a masked ball in honor of a visiting prince. The christening of a noble child became another opportunity for display. Even when the city outside endured political tension or economic hardship, the feasts continued, each one a carefully staged declaration that the empire's heart still beat strong. Maria Magdalena understood the purpose. She also understood its cost. In the quiet moments between courses, when the music softened and the servants moved like shadows between the tables, she would sometimes let her gaze drift over the room. She saw courtiers laughing with calculated charm, ambassadors leaning close over wine glasses, younger archduchesses whispering behind their fans. In these moments, the spectacle felt like a theater piece she had performed too many times. She knew her lines, her cues, the placement of her hands on the table, the tilt of her head when addressed by a guest, but the script left no space for rest or for herself. The feasts were beautiful, but their beauty was exhausting. Behind the shimmer of glassware and the swirl of music lay the truth of her life. Endless repetition, an unspoken expectation to be both ornament and host, and the quiet toll of years spent under the weight of ceremony. And in those halls, surrounded by light, Maria Magdalena's shadow began to lengthen. An unseen prelude to the night when, at such a banquet, her body would finally give way. In the Hofburg, gossip moved like candlelight, flickering, impossible to catch, yet capable of illuminating the most guarded corners. Beneath the brilliance of court ceremonies, quiet conversations unfolded in corridors lined with tapestries, in alcoves shielded by heavy drapes, in the pauses between toasts when music softened and the hum of voices rose. By her middle years, Archduchess Maria Magdalena had become a subject of these murmurs. To most, she was the dignified, ever-present daughter of the late Emperor Leopold I, a woman of grace who had dutifully embraced her role within the palace. But among the sharper tongues of Vienna, her life of service without marriage raised questions. Some whispers focused on her health. Court physicians, bound by discretion, never spoke openly, but attendants hinted at recurring ailments, a fragile constitution, occasional fainting, a pallor that not even rouge could disguise. There were claims that she avoided certain foods, that she sometimes retired early from evening entertainments, that she preferred the cool solitude of her private chambers over the suffocating heat of crowded banquets. Others turned to politics. The Habsburg family was a vast and branching network of alliances, rivalries, and ambitions, while Maria Magdalena herself was not known to seek influence. Her position as a permanent fixture in Vienna meant she witnessed, and perhaps overheard, more than some courtiers found comfortable. It was whispered that certain factions within the family preferred her unmarried precisely because she could be kept close, under watch. A neutral presence, who nonetheless saw everything. And then there were the darker, more conspiratorial murmurs. A few suggested that the Archduchess's unmarried state had less to do with circumstance and more to do with design. That perhaps an old slight, a misaligned alliance, or an internal feud had ensured she would never be placed on the chessboard of European marriage. These theories were impossible to prove. Yet they persisted, fed by the opacity of dynastic decision-making and the ever-present suspicion that, in royal courts, even inaction was strategic. In the smoky corners of Vienna's salons, those semi-private gatherings where nobility mingled with artists, merchants, and the occasional foreign agent, her name sometimes came up in connection with more sinister speculation. There were whispers of subtle poisons, the kind said to weaken without killing, to maintain an image of health while steadily eroding the body. Such talk was common in any royal court of the era, where the fear of hidden assassins was as real as the political stakes that made them plausible. But no evidence ever surfaced, and the Archduchess herself seemed untouched by such fears, moving through her duties with the same measured poise as always. Still, the pattern of her life, her careful diet, her occasional absences, her seeming withdrawal from prolonged travel, gave these rumors fertile ground. Even a sudden headache at a reception could become fodder for speculation by the next morning. A glance exchanged between a physician and a lady-in-waiting might spark a week's worth of conjecture. The truth was likely far more ordinary, yet no less poignant. A life spent within the rigid structure of court exacted a toll on the body as much as the spirit. The rich, heavy foods of imperial banquets, the lack of regular exercise, the long hours spent standing in constrictive gowns and corsets. All of it wore down health over decades, combined with the pressure to remain ever composed, ever available. The result was a slow but steady exhaustion that no amount of jewels or titles could offset. Maria Magdalena, for her part, gave no public acknowledgement of the rumors. She neither denied nor addressed them, understanding that in court life, to protest too much was to invite further scrutiny. Instead, she allowed the stories to swirl around her like the rustle of brocade skirts, background noise to the larger performance of her existence. And yet, she could not have been entirely unaware. The sidelong glances when she excused herself from a late supper, the slightly hushed tone when her name was mentioned after a fainting spell, the sudden change of subject when she entered a room mid-conversation. These were the subtle cues of a world in which image was everything and truth was always negotiable. The whispers did not change her role, nor did they alter the demands placed upon her. If anything, they added another layer to the invisible burden she carried. The knowledge that her life, however circumscribed, was still a story told by others, shaped by voices she could not control. And so, beneath the golden canopy of the Hofburg's banqueting hall, where chandeliers blazed and music masked the murmurs, Maria Magdalena continued to smile, to stand, to serve. All the while, the quiet speculation of the court wound itself like smoke through the air, foreshadowing the night when those whispers would grow into the shocked silence of her sudden collapse. May 1st, 1743 began as so many grand occasions in Vienna did, with a palace humming like a well-tuned instrument, every servant, musician, and courtier moving in anticipation of the evening's performance. The Hofburg was dressed for celebration. Gold candelabra were polished to a mirrored gleam, crystal glasses lined the banquet tables, and the scent of roasting game drifted through the vaulted corridors. It was a night to mark a royal occasion. A night when the empire's power would be displayed not in armies or edicts, but in the sheer spectacle of abundance. Archduchess Maria Magdalena, now 54, took her place among the guests as she had done countless times before. Her gown was a masterpiece of courtly fashion. Deep burgundy silk overlaid with gold thread embroidery, the weight of its fabric pressing against her shoulders. Pearls looped around her neck caught the candlelight, and a fine lace veil softened the silver strands in her hair. To all appearances, she was the same poised figure who had stood beside empresses and hosted dignitaries for decades. The great hall was alive with sound. The warm murmur of conversation, the lilting strains of violins, the occasional ripple of laughter. The Archduchess sat midway along the high table, her posture perfect, her expression serene. She spoke with those beside her, an old friend from her mother's household, a visiting noble from Bohemia. Her voice low, her gestures composed. Plates were brought and cleared in a steady rhythm. Spiced venison, delicate pastries, goblets refilled with fine red wine. But beneath the glow of the chandeliers, subtle signs emerged. Those seated nearby would later recall that she touched her temple more than once, her fingers lingering as though to steady herself. At one point, she placed her fork down carefully, as if gauging whether she had the strength to lift it again when she laughed at a remark. It was softer than usual, her eyes momentarily clouded. Then, as the servants cleared another course, the change came swiftly. Maria Magdalena's smile faltered. She drew a breath that seemed to catch halfway, her hand rising again to her head. A frown crossed her face, brief, sharp, almost startled. The noble beside her leaned in to ask if she was well, but before he could finish, she slumped forward. Her goblet tipped, spilling wine across the embroidered tablecloth. The murmur of the room stilled. The musicians faltered, their bows hovering above the strings. A single candle guttered in the sudden draft as courtiers rose from their seats. For a moment, no one moved, uncertain whether to maintain the veneer of order or rush to her side. It was the Hofdame to another Archduchess who first reached her, calling softly, then urgently, for help. Two footmen lifted Maria Magdalena gently, her head lolling against the shoulder of one, her face pale in the golden light. The royal physician was summoned from a nearby chamber, but even in his haste, precious minutes passed. When he arrived, the Archduchess was barely conscious, her breathing shallow, her pulse weak. Some in the hall were asked to return to their seats. Others stood frozen, unwilling to resume the feast. The grand occasion, with its glitter and ceremony, seemed to fade into a fragile, uneasy quiet. Whispers began almost instantly. A stroke, some said, brought on by years of strain and perhaps worsened by the heat and the wine. Others exchanged glances, heavy with the weight of long-standing rumors. Had the whispers of poison been more than idle talk? The physician said nothing to confirm or deny. She was carried from the hall to her private chambers, the heavy skirts and lace of her gown rustling faintly in the silence. The doors closed, shutting out the guests, the music, the feast. Those who remained in the hall were encouraged to continue, as though the interruption were a mere delay. But the atmosphere had changed. Conversation was subdued, the toasts forced. In her rooms, attendants worked quickly, loosening her corset, cooling her forehead with damp cloths. The physician examined her, his face unreadable. He prescribed rest, though his eyes told another story. By the small hours of the morning, her condition had worsened. She drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring a few words that none could quite make out. Before the city stirred at dawn, the news had already begun to spread in the palace corridors. Archduchess Maria Magdalena was dead. The official cause would be given as sudden illness. No further details offered. Outside, Vienna awoke to an ordinary spring day, unaware that one of its most constant figures had left the stage forever. Her life had been spent in service to ceremony, and in the end, it was within that same ceremonial space, a banquet hall shimmering with light and music, that her body finally yielded. The feast went on, but the seat she had occupied remained empty, a silent testament to the truth no ritual could disguise. For a member of the Habsburg family, death was usually a matter of spectacle. The passing of a princess might be marked by days of public mourning, processions through the streets, the tolling of bells from every church tower in Vienna. Coffins would be paraded under black-draped arches, their arrival at the Capuchin crypt accompanied by choirs and incense. It was a final performance, one last assertion of the dynasty's splendor before the body joined the long line of imperial dead. But for Archduchess Maria Magdalena, the farewell was quieter, more restrained, almost intimate by comparison. Preparations began in the early hours of May 2nd, 1743, while the palace still carried the hushed air of shock. Her body was washed and dressed by attendants who had served her for decades, their movements careful and reverent. The gown they chose was far simpler than the heavy silks she had worn in life. A white habit of the Order of St. Clare, symbolizing humility before God. Around her waist, they tied a cord, the knots representing the vows she had taken spiritually, if not in a convent. She was placed in a wooden coffin lined with pale satin. A crucifix rested in her folded hands, a rosary wound loosely through her fingers. The scent of beeswax and myrrh filled the room as candles were lit at each corner of the bier. Those closest to her, ladies-in-waiting, senior servants, a handful of relatives, were allowed in to pray. They spoke little, their footsteps muffled on the thick carpets, their eyes lingering on a face that seemed almost at peace. The lines of formality softened in death. The announcement to the public was brief, almost perfunctory. Her Imperial Highness, the Archduchess, Maria Magdalena, has died suddenly of illness. Funeral rites will be observed in the Imperial Chapel before burial in the Capuchin crypt. There were no proclamations of national mourning, no grand invitations to foreign courts. On the morning of the funeral, the cortege formed in the inner courtyard of the Hofburg. A small honor guard flanked the coffin, which was covered in a black velvet pall embroidered with the double-headed eagle of the Holy Roman Empire. A chaplain walked ahead, murmuring prayers. The air was cool, touched by the lingering damp of early May. The procession wound slowly through the palace corridors to the Burgkapelle, the imperial chapel. There, a requiem mass was sung by the court choir, their voices rising to the vaulted ceiling in a solemn weave of harmony. The organ rolled through deep, resonant chords that seemed to vibrate in the chest. Maria Magdalena's sisters, who were still in Vienna, stood together, veiled in black. The emperor's surviving children and grandchildren attended, their faces a tableau of composure, betraying little to the onlookers. Despite the grandeur of the setting, there was a palpable sense of absence, not just of the deceased, but of the energy that usually marked such events. The service was shorter than most imperial funerals, the readings familiar but briskly delivered. When the final blessing was given, the pallbearers lifted the coffin and began the slow walk to the Kapuzinergruft, the Capuchin crypt where centuries of Habsburgs lay entombed. The descent into the crypt was a journey from the brilliance of courtly life into cool stone shadow. Narrow steps led to a dimly lit chamber where ornate sarcophagi lined the walls, each engraved with titles and honors. Maria Magdalena's coffin, simple compared to the elaborate bronze caskets of emperors and empresses, was placed among the tombs of other unmarried archduchesses and lesser royals. The friars of the Capuchin order performed the final rites, their voices echoing softly off the walls. A handful of family members and close attendants remained to witness the sealing of the tomb. There was no gun salute, no public declaration. When the friars extinguished their candles, the chamber was returned to its usual stillness. Outside, life in Vienna moved on. The carriages rattled through the streets, merchants called out in the markets, and music played in the taverns. In the palace, preparations for the next court event were already underway. For those who had known her, the contrast was striking. In life, Maria Magdalena had stood at the center of so many ceremonies, banquets, receptions, state visits, ensuring that others were honored and remembered. In death, her own departure was marked with muted dignity, but without the full blaze of imperial remembrance. Perhaps it was her own wish for simplicity, or perhaps her passing was considered less significant in the vast machinery of Habsburg politics. Either way, the image lingered. A princess who had spent her life in the glow of chandeliers and the press of ritual, laid to rest in the cool, quiet dark, her final procession a shadow of the splendor she had once served. The days after Maria Magdalena's burial passed without the kind of lingering tribute that often kept a royal name alive in the public mind. For other Habsburgs, there might be commissioned portraits in mourning garb, elaborate memorial services repeated annually, or charitable foundations established in their honor. For her, there was little beyond the bare record of her death, entered in the court ledger and a few lines in the Vienna newspapers. At first, within the Hofburg's walls, her absence was felt in the smallest of ways. The ceremonial table at evening meals no longer had her steady presence. The chapel services missed the familiar sight of her bowed head and tightly clasped hands. In the women's quarters, ladies in waiting sometimes paused at the doorway to her now quiet chambers, their eyes catching on the faint indent in the arm of a chair, where she had once sat for hours doing embroidery. Yet, the tide of court life was relentless. A new season of receptions and marriages shifted the palace's attention outward. The political alliances that consumed the emperor's ministers left little space for sentimental recollections. When her name did come up in conversation, it was usually in passing, the late Archduchess mentioned only as a marker in time, not as a person whose life and character warranted discussion. Outside the palace, in the city of Vienna, she had never been a figure of intense fascination, like a young empress or a controversial royal spouse. She had been visible, yes, attending church, greeting dignitaries, standing in the background of processions, but not the subject of rumor or legend. For the common people, she was a shadow behind the brighter lights of her family, a quiet constant who slipped from view once gone. The one place where her memory lingered longest was among the servants who had known her as a woman rather than an icon. An old chambermaid, tasked with overseeing the cleaning of her rooms after her death, is said to have wept quietly when folding the last of her linen. A palace steward, recalling her kindness in arranging for a pension for his widowed sister, kept her small gift of a silver rosary as a family heirloom. These personal recollections lived on in corners of the palace far from the glitter of court, told in low voices to those who would listen. In the archives, her legacy reduced itself to paper. Neatly bound documents recorded her correspondence, her household expenses, and the inventory of her possessions. Jewelry was redistributed among relatives. Her modest art collection was absorbed into the vast holdings of the Habsburgs. Items with her initials were sometimes re-engraved, their former ownership unmentioned. Even her portrait, once displayed in a quiet gallery, was eventually moved to storage to make room for more politically important figures. The Capuchin crypt, too, played its role in the quiet erasure. There, among dozens of other coffins, hers bore only the essentials: name, title, and dates of birth and death. No inscription told of her service to the court, her steadfastness, or her personal sacrifices. Visitors might glance at the nameplate, nod briefly, and move on toward the grander tombs of emperors and empresses. As the decades rolled forward, even family memory dimmed. Younger Habsburgs, born long after her passing, would know her only as an entry in the genealogies. A sister to so-and-so, a daughter of Leopold I, one of many archduchesses whose stories blurred together in the long tapestry of the dynasty. In a way, it was the ultimate irony. She had spent her life safeguarding the ceremonial heart of the Habsburg court, ensuring that the traditions and rituals remained unbroken. Yet when her own moment came to pass into history, those same mechanisms offered her no lasting spotlight. She became what so many royal women of her time were fated to be: an unspoken name, carried forward only by the echo of duty, swallowed by the endless march of imperial time. Her story, quietly fading in the palace shadows, was not one of scandal or grandeur, but of service, steadfast, uncelebrated, and ultimately forgotten. Centuries later, Maria Magdalena's name survives mostly in brittle books and yellowed ledgers, tucked away in the quiet corners of European archives. Her life is rarely studied in depth, overshadowed by the drama of emperors, war leaders, and royal consorts whose deeds, both great and terrible, make for more compelling headlines. Yet, when one begins to trace the faint threads of her existence, an unexpected clarity emerges. She was, in many ways, a portrait of countless women in history whose loyalty to their roles ensured their disappearance from memory. The modern visitor to Vienna might walk through the Hofburg's lavish halls, gaze at portraits of glittering monarchs, and never know that one of Leopold's daughters once moved quietly through these very corridors, carrying on her shoulders the subtle labor of keeping the court's machinery running. There is no dedicated exhibit to her, no plaque beneath a painting noting her sacrifices. The absence is telling. It reflects a broader truth about the historical record and who gets to remain in its spotlight. Historians who do glance at her life often note how emblematic her trajectory is of unmarried royal women of the era. In a political system where marriages were forged to seal treaties or extend influence, a princess who remained within her own court rather than marrying abroad often became a permanent fixture in the background, useful, dependable, but not destined for individual legacy. She might advise younger relatives, manage aspects of palace life, and serve as a trusted confidant to rulers. But her name would rarely appear in the annals of statecraft or cultural innovation. The tragedy of Maria Magdalena is not merely that she died suddenly at a banquet, but that the decades she devoted to her family's stability were treated as invisible labor. In this way, her story resonates strongly with modern discussions about the way society values, or fails to value, the quiet, sustaining work performed behind the scenes. Today we might call it emotional labor or administrative glue, but in the 18th century, it was simply expected. And when performed perfectly, it left almost no trace. In some respects, her anonymity protected her from the scandals that marred other Habsburg reputations. Without marriage alliances to pull her into foreign disputes, without children whose fates might become political pawns, she was spared some of the turbulence that destroyed others in her family. But that same shield also robbed her of a narrative arc that history finds memorable. She became, in effect, a blank space in the lineage chart, a name with dates, but no accompanying tale. In the modern era, efforts to recover such stories often come from outside official institutions. Independent researchers, amateur genealogists, and even enthusiasts of royal history online have begun to piece together fragments of her life from scattered documents, baptismal records, inventory lists, church archives. They are the ones noting the significance of her long service at court, her absence from diplomatic marriages, her role in internal Habsburg affairs. To them, she is not a footnote, but a case study in the architecture of royal invisibility. It is striking, too, how the silence surrounding her contrasts with the endless chatter about her more famous relatives. Archduchesses who married into foreign thrones, like Maria Theresa's daughters, remain cultural icons. Their likenesses appear on postcards, in costume dramas, in museum gift shops. Maria Magdalena, by comparison, belongs to a realm of memory that is almost entirely archival, a place where the public rarely goes, and where even scholars tread lightly. And yet, this absence has a peculiar power. By studying her, one is reminded that history's loudest voices are not always its most representative. The majority of people, even in royal circles, live and die without their names etched into monuments or immortalized in art. Their contributions are folded invisibly into the lives of others, like stitches hidden in the lining of a gown. Maria Magdalena's story, in the end, may never command the same attention as a crowned ruler or a political revolutionary. But in an age when historians are increasingly interested in the overlooked and the undervalued, her life offers a lens into the quiet endurance that has always underpinned public grandeur. She was not a queen, not a mother of kings, not a famed beauty. She was, instead, a constant presence in the background, a reminder that the scaffolding of power is often held up by those whose names we do not remember. And perhaps, in our own time, that is the tragedy most worth uncovering. History has a peculiar way of rewarding spectacle while starving subtlety. Archduchess Maria Magdalena of Austria lived at the center of one of Europe's most powerful courts. Yet her legacy is barely more than a whisper between the pages of Habsburg family trees. She did not wage wars, she did not ignite revolutions, and she did not scandalize her family with political betrayals. But perhaps that is precisely why she vanished from the popular memory. Her sudden collapse at a banquet in 1743 was not just the end of a life. It was the quiet extinguishing of a story that few cared to tell. In the months that followed, the court moved on. New alliances were formed. New ceremonies filled the halls, and the space she had occupied, both physically and emotionally, was absorbed without pause. There was no enduring public mourning, no great artistic tribute. Her name slipped silently into the records, where it would rest for centuries, awaiting rediscovery. And yet, the more we examine her life, the clearer it becomes that there is value in remembering figures like Maria Magdalena. She represents the countless individuals, especially women, whose work sustained empires from the shadows. Her decades in service to her family's stability, her role as a confidant and quiet diplomat within palace walls, her capacity to exist without the fanfare demanded by titles, all speak to a form of endurance rarely celebrated in history. In telling her story now, we reclaim not just her memory, but the dignity of all who lived without the reward of remembrance. It forces us to ask, how many lives have been built, spent, and lost in the scaffolding that supports the stage of history, only to be swept away once the curtain falls? The tragedy of Maria Magdalena is not just that she died. It is that she was erased, not through malice, but through the quiet machinery of historical neglect. And in that erasure, we see the fragility of legacy itself. If we can breathe life back into her name, even for a moment, perhaps we can begin to challenge the idea that only the loudest, most dramatic stories are worth telling. Because sometimes, it is the faintest voices that reveal the most about the world they inhabited. This has been Dark Ages Unveiled. If you believe histories forgotten deserve their stories told, subscribe to our channel so together we can keep the past alive, one voice at a time.